Hey everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Today's going to be a good one. We're going to be talking about Canadian military history as we always do, but this one's going to be a bit broader, as in I have someone who does the broad stuff, and that's a very good thing. So I have Craig Baird on today from Canadian History Ehx. I did probably pronounce that wrong. He can correct me in a second here, but it's a podcast. He's active on social media. He covers all kinds of topics. So we're just going to be chatting today. If you guys have questions, please fire away. It can be about the content that Craig does, even random questions. It doesn't even have to be military today because we both do all kinds of the things, but Craig is definitely one who's, using the military terms in the trenches all the time, doing the different stuff on a daily basis pretty much, whereas I'm pretty focused. But I'm pretty excited. So we get to talk about Canadian history, kind of doing stuff with podcasts, digital history, all that fun stuff. So it's going to be a good one. So, hey, Craig, thanks for coming on. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks. And you were close. Canadian History Ehx.
Ehx. Okay, we just ignore the.
Yeah, I thought it was really clever making that name a few years ago, and sometimes I wonder.
I like it. I just get confused. Why don't I don't pay attention to these details? Sometimes even my own stuff. I'm like, what did I say? Anyway, but yeah, it's good. Like I said, you do. I don't know. I'll let you run the program in a second here of all your podcasting because there's a lot, and I'm sure I'll miss some if I do it. But what I always like to ask when I have a new guest on is kind of how did you get here? And I mean this like we were just talking. I mean this in the best way possible. I do Canadian history myself. I have a PhD in the subject, so I'm not judging in a mean way. But as we've already talked about, and we'll probably get to, is there's this kind of connotation about Canadian history that's boring or not interesting or whatever. So how did you end up at this point? Like, how did you get to be like one day like, hey, I'll make a Canadian history podcast? Like, how did you get there?
For me, it was kind of a long meandering road. I have a degree in computer science, and I did that for a few years. And then I became a journalist. And as a journalist, I was working in a lot of small towns. And I'd always been interested in history. I had originally wanted to be an archaeologist, but kind of moved into computers. And I loved history growing up. And I always found, especially like in Alberta, our history teaching is very limited. I mean, we learn about the Northwest Resistance, a lot about Louis Riel, Cold War, but we didn't learn anything about Eastern Canada. 1837-38 rebellions, I didn't even know about until I started looking into history myself. I had no idea that even happened. And so then I became, when I was a journalist and I was in these small towns, I'd read the old newspapers and then I'd start to write up, little history tidbits and little history stories. And I found I was really enjoying that. And then when I stopped working as a journalist, I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to kind of dive into what I want to do. And that was podcasting and Canadian history. And like you said, there's this misconception of, oh, Canadian history is boring. Everybody thinks Confederation is Canadian history and that's all there is. And, we don't do anything interesting. And so with the podcast, I was like, I wanted to show that Canadian history is interesting. One of the first episodes I ever did was about Ken Carter, who's the mad Canadian. He was this daredevil who built a car and strapped a rocket to it and was going to jump over the St. Lawrence. And I'm like, you know what? That's interesting. It's not boring. It's crazy. Exactly. It's mad. And then I kind of just expanded from there. And I wanted to look at a lot of things from Canadian history and not really focus on, like I do with From John to Justin, but not focus on like Confederation. I want to focus on the smaller stories, the margarine bootleggers from Newfoundland who was bringing us margarine when we weren't allowed to have margarine, or really interesting stories from the prairies and the interesting people, and also have a strong focus on Indigenous history because I found that was definitely at the time something that wasn't out there a lot, and I wanted to put that kind of stuff out there.
Yeah, and I mean those are all amazing goals. I mean, I think a lot of our goals overlap with what we're both trying to do, how we go about doing it, how we support each other, and loving your content and listening to it when I can. When I'm not, so busy I forget what day of the week it is. But other than that, I'm sure you get that too. But it's great, yeah. And I was wondering because I have some very loyal guests who are not Canadian, right? I'm British, I have Brits, I have Americans, which it's great to have this small international cohort that's growing all the time. So, and they might not know about your stuff or even generally what we're talking about. So I figured, like me and me were talking about, we don't really have a plan, but I would like you to talk about the podcast series or different ones.
Sure.
I don't know the podcasting terms. I'm sorry, but
Oh,
the different series, I guess.
series. That's what I call them. Series. Yeah.
Yeah. So like how that goes. On all the different products you offer. And then again, if audience members have questions about what we're talking about, I mean, you mentioned, smuggling margarine. I'm sure a lot of people, even Canadians, have no idea what we're talking about. But anyway, so things like that. So if you could just kind of give us the run through, maybe, start how you with your original podcast and then talk about all your different offerings, that'd be awesome.
So the original is Canadian History Ehx. That was kind of the one that I started back in 2019. Started it kind of slow. Was just whenever I had time. And then I kind of got to the point where I was like, I'm going to commit to this 3 times a week. And I'm going to put out content on a regular basis. And then eventually it became, actually when the pandemic started is when I kind of shifted to making it my full-time job, because it's what I wanted to do. And, I had savings and everything. So I thought, why not? And so it's just past, I think tomorrow, my episode, or 2 days from now, my episode on women's suffrage is about the 508th episode of Canadian History Ehx. So like there's tons of content. It's all on my website. Like I think I got like 600 and some Canadian history posts on my website. And so I started with that, but I found that there were things I wanted to talk about and I didn't want to just keep putting it into Canadian History Ehx to the point where I had 7 episodes a week and, people are like, okay, enough, man. Like I can't listen to all of these. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to split off 2 podcasts. So I created 2 podcasts in December of 2020, and one was Pucks and Cups, because I love hockey. I love especially early hockey history when it was really rough and wild and crazy. So that's what that focuses on, is Pucks and Cups focuses on our early hockey history. And then the other one I created was From John to Justin. And originally that was, okay, I'm going to look at every prime minister in Canadian history from Sir John A. Macdonald all the way up to Justin Trudeau. And I found I was getting such a huge response to that podcast. I was like, I want to expand on this. So I covered every election in Canadian history. And right now we're in January, I'll finish covering every opposition leader who never became prime minister. And then after that, it's going to be every premier of every province in Canadian history. So I've got content to last me for years on there. And then I did those for a while. From John to Justin continuously, like Canadian History Ehx. It has no breaks. But Pucks and Cups, I kind of ended the first season, and then I started doing Coast to Coast, which looked at the building of the Transcontinental Railway. And then I did Canada's Great War, which is obviously about Canada in the First World War. And so Coast to Coast is finished because it was only, I think, 12 episodes. And then Canada's Great War is done at season 1. And once I'm done season 2 of Pucks and Cups, which is running right now, then Canada's Great War will start up in its season 2. So those are all the podcasts. And then I do, videos on my YouTube channel where I've traveled to different places, mostly in Alberta right now, and visited historical sites, and I talk about them and things like that.
So I wanted to say before I forget, I linked everything. I forgot the YouTube channel. I'll do that after, though. I'll include that. Sorry, I'm just reading.
No worries.
We'll get to it in a second. I think you should be able to see them too on your sidebar there, and some great comments there. But anyway, so I was going to say, I linked everything. I linked your website down below, so everyone check it out. Subscribe to on it, where follow. Sorry, again, I get mixed up with the terminology. On whatever your favorite platform is, because I did check you out. You're all over the place, as you always mentioned, but I'm a researcher. I can't help myself. Not that I'm calling Craig a liar, everyone. That's not what I'm saying. I just get weird about these things because I make claims sometimes and I'm like, that one wasn't true, especially if I made a technical Anyway, so check him out there. All your social media is there, and you're quite active on Twitter like myself. And I did want to say this while I am plugging social media because it's good. But you do like I do, or try to do. I haven't been doing as much recently, is get involvement, get people interested in it by asking what they want to see, how they want to go about it. I remember you talking about the Transcontinental Railway and then the First World War, like, what should I do these? Or you did a poll about what people wanted to see, and people picked those. And then you did the same for expanding From John to Justin as well. You've been putting out, feelers of what people want, and I think that's amazing. I mean, this isn't something we could have done.
No, absolutely. And it's good to
have done this. So
it's good to get that for sure.
But sorry, I was laughing because I was just laughing at Susan's comment here. Sometimes I agree. Some are quite boring. Not to lie. I mean, we've had some pretty boring prime ministers. Some are If you
We
told people the stories of them, they think you're lying or it's some sort of fiction, but it's not.
It's not. There's some really interesting ones out there. Like you said, there's some boring ones. The four prime ministers we had from like 1891 to 1895. There's not much to it. John Abbott's a little bit interesting because he had a long history and he brought Nova Scotia into Confederation.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of interesting ones. I mean, Lester B. Pearson he's awesome. Like he's a really interesting one.
He's literally all over the map. Literally.
He is. Yeah, exactly. He's all over the map. He's got a long history. You got William Lyon Mackenzie King, who has 3 dogs named Pat that he adores, never marries, is devoted to his mother to the point where he prays to her, when he's got to make decisions. The whole stuff with, the occult and everything. He's interesting. And then Pierre Trudeau. I mean, I can't think there's interesting presidents, but fewer as interesting or as flamboyant as Pierre Trudeau was, in my opinion. Yeah.
Nothing like there's no American, or even I would say Britain's a little different, but even British maybe for English speaking, democracies. Yeah. Maybe a little French presidents can give Trudeau a run for his money, as far as I understand, a few of them. But anyway, yeah. So like you do this political stuff. Now you're expanding it to go to things like premiers, which people outside Canada are going to be like, what does that even mean? That the people who lead the provinces, just for the non-Canadians out there. So anyway, those are going to be coming. Have you started that one, Matt? No, I don't.
That one I'm going to be finished unless Aaron O'Toole is no longer the leader of the opposition by I think January 5th, 6th, somewhere in there, second week in January. He'll be the last one that I cover for the opposition leaders. And then kind of like what you're talking about, where I was asking opinions, I was like, how do you guys want me to do the premiers? Because I don't want to spend months on like British Columbia and then months on Alberta. Right. I was like, okay, I'll do 5 at a time, but where do you want me to start? West to east, east to west. And the overwhelming consensus was based on when they joined Confederation. So I'll start with Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia.
There's no wrong way to do it, I think.
No, absolutely.
Canada. I mean, geographically would make sense, moving one direction or the other. But Confederation has got its own, I can't help myself, but learning opportunity, right? Like
exactly.
But I mean, even at the beginning, right? And this is kind of just talking about a history topic, but Confederation in of itself, these early premiers some of them are the figures that help bring the country together.
Oh yeah.
You're Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia almost leaving the country right away.
Yeah, we could thank John Abbott for that one. He kept
we don't talk about that
together
too much, but it's true and very interesting. Which again, I won't steal your thunder, but I think it's again, like I said, there's not a wrong way to do it.
No,
it's an interesting way, and I think the way you're going about it is great. I mean, talking about all these different leaders, and to me, at some points, and I'll just say this is my own opinion. I mean, you can maybe disagree, but some of the premiers are even more interesting than the prime ministers because
absolutely
there's some even because I'm based in Ontario and I've lived in Ontario my whole life. I mean, you're out west in Alberta. Some of the premiers in Ontario that I didn't really start to really understand until I did the PhD and trying to understand what's going on with that. I mean, people like George Drew, and then you had all these different leaders into the mix, and it's just like, these guys are out there and we don't talk about them. And
George Drew was an interesting one. He was in the opposition leaders because he made the jump. Absolutely. There's so many. Amora de Cosmos, the second premier of British Columbia. I mean, he might have certifiably been insane later in his life. Like he was trying to sell hot meals that you would take to the Yukon, and this weird business that made no sense. And he was definitely a very weird, flamboyant, but he was the second premier, and nobody outside of BC probably knows that much about him at all. Just his name. I mean,
that's not his birth name.
No.
He changed his name to the lover of the universe, or cosmos, which is
universe lover or something like
just odd. I mean, we have that's why I like it, because and Susan makes an interesting point because she lives in the U.S. And she's talking about how sometimes the leaders down there are not boring, but in for the bad ways. And I think in Canada they're not boring for the good ways. I mean, they're kooky dudes. I mean, except for one. We've had one female premier, premier, prime minister. There's different terms, but PM. But she was only in for I like to say, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, pretty much.
To the wolves. But anyway, maybe we can talk about that in a second. But just all these different characters. I mean, I can't get away from King, obviously. Second World War, my an interwar period, which was a huge chunk of my dissertation and my own interests, because I mean, you can't escape King even if you try. He
Oh,
pops
no.
up in the craziest places. Like he's connected to everything from the Vimy Memorial, and this is just military history. Vimy Memorial, which is in the 20s, like, and he's
Exactly.
through there through the end of the war and then passed into the early Cold War time period. And
21 years. I mean, he covers it all.
and I mean, his diaries alone,
Oh,
if the listeners don't know what I'm talking about, and actually, you know what, Craig, you can explain it. You know it too. So.
sure. Yeah, all his diaries are scanned online. You can just search for words, and that's what it was actually a great resource for the opposition leaders, for essentially from the 1920s to the late 1940s. Because anytime I wanted to like get some quotes and things like that, I just searched for the opposition leader's name. It would come up, and sometimes he would be just hammering into this opposition leader because he hated them, and other times he really respected them, and liked them and got along with them, and it just kind of gives an outside perspective, which I really like, rather than just going through pages that are written by whatever the supporters or things like that. Like you're actually reading this guy's diary that he would write and dictate, and it was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and that's great too. And one other reason, sorry, I can't help myself again, but that's why another reason why I like your work is you're plugging into primary work and kind of getting into that. I mean, I'm not directing this at anyone in particular because there's hardly any Canadian podcasts as there is or history podcasts, sorry. But sometimes, and I'm guilty of it too, we can get kind of lazy and stuck in the secondary sources, and just it's easy to grab the book off the shelf. But getting into the primaries is its own thing, and that's why I think it's important. But King's is so interesting for just even the access, right? Because like you said, it's completely all scanned, it's all online, it's word searchable, which I don't think there's any parallel to this.
No, I mean, it's everything. Everything he talks about, and
everything.
It's, I mean, from the 1890s to the last entry is, I think, his nurse actually saying that, he passed away. And so it's his whole life. And it's, you see his worry over his dog, which I don't know which one, 2 or 3, Pat, because it's not feeling well. Like you actually see a lot of personal stuff in there, and it's really interesting.
Well, it gets personal. I mean, and then people are always, that's again, kind of our theme maybe, is the boring. And I'm like, look up Prime Minister Mackenzie King.
Exactly.
Find his diary, which literally all you have to do is Google Mackenzie King diary. It'll come right up from the Library Archives Canada website. If the website's not down, there's been some issues with that lately.
Yeah, there has.
Anyway, that's another topic that we could fill several videos probably. But anyway, sorry, you just plug it in, anything you want in. And I mean, some of the most famous ones are his comments about Hitler when he meets him in the late 1930s when. And this is the thing about King. He had a bit of a grandiose view of himself internationally. He thought he could fix the problem. Clearly, nobody was listening to him. He thought they were, but they were not. Anyway, so he basically writes this strange, I don't even know how to describe it, passage about Hitler and his eyes, and it's just awkward. I can't really paraphrase it really off the top of my head. So if you are interested, go look at it up.
In his defense, he didn't know people would be reading his diary. 70 years he died.
Well, he wanted it burned on his death, right?
Yeah,
which did not happen.
No. Nope. Now anybody can read it.
His literary executors thought it was too good to pass up. But anyway, so that's obviously focusing on him. King is an interesting character. And then Borden in the First World War is an interesting character in his own right. He doesn't write as much as King because no one does. But I mean, I've looked at him as well, for obvious reasons. First World War, did a good chunk of some of my PhD work around that, and him and his decisions and everything. And it's just these characters that I feel don't get attention because they're going to be boring. And it's just not the case.
If you take the time to actually look into them. I mean, for me, one of who I find generally the most interesting usually is John Diefenbaker. Yeah, because he's somebody who, he was like, I want to be prime minister. He tried to get into parliament for like 14 years, finally gets into parliament, and then he continually tries to become leader, never becomes leader until the 50s. And then the groundwork laid by George Drew actually allows him to become prime minister. And then he's no longer prime minister, and then his party turns against him. And he kind of creates this mythology around him. The whole, when I was 10 years old, I was selling newspapers, and Sir Wilfrid Laurier was in Saskatoon, and he started talking to me. And I said, sorry, Mr. Laurier, I got to get back to work. I can't keep talking about whatever it was, Canadian politics. And it's like, by all accounts, if this actually did happen, it was a very quick, here's your newspaper, nice to meet you, Mr. Laurier. And that was it. But he creates this in his memoirs, this grand thing of how, I'm sorry, I'm Prime Minister, but I got to get back to work. I can't keep talking to you, even though I'm a 10-year-old boy. And so I find that very interesting. He plans his own funeral. He puts he gives himself a state funeral. He has this grandiose view of himself. In many ways, he was a very good prime minister. He did bring in a lot of things. He gave the indigenous the vote and things like that. But then in other ways, he's just somebody who, in his own mind, he has a different perspective of who he is versus how everybody sees John Diefenbaker. And in some ways, I feel bad for him. He had his high point, and it just seemed like nobody liked him in his party at one point.
I think that's fortunate for the Conservatives, that seems to be a trend.
Yeah, true enough. Yeah.
Not a little like man himself.
They'll turn on themselves.
Either they elect someone or the leader of the party. I'm just sort of thinking about the Second World War, and then again the mix of who would be party leader at that point is a story within and of itself, which you'll get to. It's complicated. Who's even in power? Who's not even in? Arthur Meehan has himself. I would argue, the man is boring as watching paint dry, but the things going on around him and the things he's involved in are so interesting. And speaking again of leaders who weren't liked, it's the bill.
And King hated.
He hated him.
Just could not stand him at all.
He hated being in the same room with the man, even on the floor of the Commons.
Yeah,
he hated him.
The best story I have with those that I can remember is when Meehan was running in a by-election. And, the general rule is if a leader of another party is running, you don't run your candidate against them. So King's like, okay, I won't do that. But then he puts the party resources into, I think it was the Cooperative Federation's candidate, and he gets elected, and Meehan doesn't get elected, and then Meehan has to resign as leader. It's such a petty thing to do, but they hated each other going back to university. It was a deep dislike that these two had for each other, and it's rare to see that much of a dislike between an opposition leader and a prime minister in Canadian history. Usually it's civil. This was not. This was pure dislike.
He hated, because again, I had to look at this because I as my viewers know, I did the Battle of Hong Kong, but I also looked at the after events, and there's the Hong Kong Inquiry, which is done in 1942, and I'm sure you'll come up on this because Drew is a huge figure in this. But Meehan's connected because he's leader, and then there's literally points in King's diary where he's like, "It's a conspiracy against me. Meehan and Drew are fighting against me. They want to bring me down." I mean, he's right.
Yeah.
It's true, but it just sounds so paranoid because they just hated each other. They all hated each other, and this is something you don't often see. In Canadian politics.
You don't King doesn't refuses to cede power when he loses the election, which he's constitutionally allowed to do because he was prime minister. Right. But I think part of that was just he didn't like Meehan so much he could just not fathom losing to this guy and having him be prime minister.
Well, and then that episode itself, the King Byng affair, as it's called, which has all kinds of connections to Canadian military history because that's Julian Byng, the commander of this is another myth fighting thing that I love to do. The Canadian commander at Vimy Ridge, which and it was not Curry, it was Julian Byng, a British general. That takes away a bit from the myth there, the Canadian fight. Actually, not really. Anyway, so they have this big row about he loses the election, but he still tries to keep power because he can. But then Byng dissolves the government anyway, and it just leads to this almost near constitutional crisis. But anyway, we get through that. Hard to talk about it in a forum like this, but it's another interesting story that we were taught it in school in Ontario, at least.
We weren't, out here.
For 5 seconds. We're like, oh, this is important because Canada kind of was trying to stand on its own 2 feet at this point, and that's really it.
Exactly. And you saw that this year because people are saying, well, the Governor General should refuse to call an election. It's like, well, if you knew about the King Byng affair, you'd realize why that won't happen now because those powers were very much taken away because we didn't like the fact that, this British person had such control over what we could do with our government. Now that's ceremonial. A big reason is because of that.
It's completely because of that. I mean, you see that almost instantly, right? Like when, sorry, we're going down the prime minister tangent here, but it happens because that happens to King, right? And he loses the election to another interesting figure, Bennett, because of the depression that had started early on, right? That's 31, or 32.
30 to 35.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, 30 to 35. And then, anyway, so he loses to Bennett, is out of the leadership until 35, until he starts saying Bennett caused the Depression, even though he was prime minister. I mean, Bennett does all kinds of things. You and me have talked about this online. I'm not a big R.B. Bennett fan just because of the way he handled things, I guess. And I don't even mean politically. I mean, more towards a personal level, and how he kind of responded to the way he was treated, literally leaves the country.
Yeah.
He's the only prime minister not buried in Canada.
Yeah, he's buried in England. He left, and that was...
He never came back.
He never ever came back. But I think the R.B. Bennett winning was like the best thing that could have happened for King.
Oh, 100%.
Because it gave King the chance not to be in charge during the worst of the Depression, and then he comes in when things are slowly starting to move up. And R.B. Bennett, well, it sucks to be you, man. You came in at the worst possible time, especially as a millionaire. People are just seeing you as this bad person, even though, in his defense, he did give a lot of money, of his own money, to people who wrote to him to help them. But at the same time, he responded very poorly to, the relief camps, the Regina, or the On to Ottawa trek, the Regina riot, being against unions and communism. And then just before the election, he's like, okay, we're going to change everything we do. We're going to follow what the United States is doing at the New Deal, because obviously I'm not going to win this election.
Yeah.
Like right before the election, he starts doing that.
Yeah, a real Hail Mary if there ever was one.
Yeah.
I mean, people talk about that all the time up here when we have elections, right? The government spending goes up and to hand it out to different groups, blah, 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 all that stuff. But that's literally what Bennett tried to do. And obviously, I mean, well, the story that I remember from school, but also because of my grandparents grew up at that time, right? They're Depression era kids, is the Bennett buggies, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like that's a pretty well-known story in Canada, right?
Oh yeah.
Cars, you couldn't run your car because you couldn't afford anything. So they were pulled by horses. So they would even just take the engine out, use the car as a sled, basically, or wagon. And that's what they called them, because they blamed Bennett for the worsening of the Depression, which is so interesting to me, because it makes sense for those of the time, especially, again, this isn't disparaging anyone, just the population wasn't as educated, I would argue, back then. They weren't as literate back then, just because of the crushing economic circumstances.
Yeah.
Either read
especially
a newspaper or starve to death. It's kind of...
absolutely. Like, I mean, I did an episode on the Great Depression, I think 3 weeks ago, and Saskatchewan was literally a third world country at one point because they lost so much money. People were sending food to Saskatchewan from elsewhere in Canada because people were starving. Like, it was so bad out there. So naturally, who are you going to blame? You're going to blame the leader of the country. That's the person, that's the symbol of the decisions being made. So R.B. Bennett's the one that is getting, and justifiably in a lot of reasons, the crap. And then, King comes along, and then he comes along right at the end. Then the Second World War happens, and it just keeps raising his profile. And then, after 21 years, he retires, and he dies 2 years later.
Yeah, 40. He retires in 48.
Dies in 50. Yeah.
Over. Yeah, and dies in 1950. Yeah, and then Sam Warren takes over, who I posted a picture of on Twitter the other day, because his statue, unlike the other prime ministers, is not on Parliament Hill. It is in front of the Canadian Supreme Court, which is obviously a purposeful choice, because he was a lawyer and worked in the government,
justice minister, and everything.
He was justice minister and AG for a good chunk of time, pretty much until he took over. He took over from Ernest Lapointe, who is another leader that doesn't get enough attention, I argue, because he was so important, because he was literally King's right-hand man. Not even, there's the French-Canadian element, obviously. Yeah. But when Lapointe dies, he dies with cancer early in the Second World War. King is like crushed. He doesn't know what to do, because Lapointe kept him on pace, basically, kept Quebec in his back pocket, but also just kept King the person on track, because again, as we've talked, he was a rather kind of erratic that's the way to put it, individual, and Lapointe was very good at keeping him on track, keeping the Liberal Party in power. I mean, you can't deny King's ability to win elections. I had a teacher one time said, or no, even my supervisor said this to me, nobody really likes him, but he wins elections, so we're going to keep him around.
It's like Diefenbaker.
Yeah,
He's okay as a leader and a parliamentarian, but he's really good at campaigning
yeah,
and winning elections. And it was kind of the same with the king. But I mean, he really chose a good person. I've always liked Louis Saint Laurent. I've always felt he was a really good prime minister. He did bring in a lot of things, but he's very little known, especially in the West, because he's between King, and then you've got Diefenbaker, Pearson, and Trudeau. So he's kind of in that mix. But I've always felt that he's one of my favorite prime ministers for sure, and he gets lost in the mix, I think.
yeah, I agree. I mean, he does, because he takes power in that, those eras of, I like to do the air quotes because I cannot grammar, but the prosperity years right after the war, the booming. I mean, the Canadian economy this is a boom time for the Canadian economy that doesn't stop for a very long time, and he's at the beginning of this, so to speak. I mean, it starts during the Second World War, but he's at this boom time. Canada's taking more of a place in the world stage, which we tend to forget about, because Pearson, who is a Liberal prime minister, but has been part of the Liberal Party for, I don't even know how long.
For years. He was, I think, all the way back to the 20s when he was joining the Department of External Affairs.
Yeah, and he was in London during the war. Sorry, Pearson was. Anyway, so he gets lost in that, that Pearson. People always assume, and this is maybe something we can talk about, because this is moving into the 1950s and 1960s with Pearson, is that Pearson was prime minister during the the Suez Crisis, and when he was awarded the Nobel Prize, he was not, which is an interesting part of that story, right? People assume like, oh yeah, our prime minister took charge and went out there and did it. And
no, exactly.
Check the dates.
It was years later. Years later. I think he got the Peace Prize in 57, and he wasn't prime minister till 63. So there was a huge gap. He wasn't even like the leader of the Liberal Party till 57. Just after Louis Saint Laurent lost, he became leader. But I mean, I think Pearson's got this kind of mythology now as the greatest prime minister, because of a lot of things like that he brought in. I mean, he started the trend to decriminalizing homosexuality and abortion and the death penalty, and our flag and all this other stuff. But when he left politics, he wasn't popular. Like, he wasn't super popular, and that's why the Conservatives thought we could actually win this next election. And they bring in Robert Stanfield, and who is actually, in all honesty, probably would have been a great prime minister. He was a red Tory. He supported things like a universal wage and stuff like that. Unfortunately for him, he came in when another guy named Pierre Elliott Trudeau came in, and you just couldn't match the charisma that Trudeau had in 1968. It was a losing cause.
Yeah, I mean, after the other big mythologized event in Canadian history, well, besides the centennial, is Expo 67 in Montreal. I mean, my mom was just over 1 year old at the time, and she's talked about it. Like, it just has the place, in Canadian society. Everyone knows when you say Expo 67, everyone knows what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And sorry, the reason why I'm bringing that up is because Trudeau and all of that is connected to this sort of, flashy Canada. We're 100 years old now, we're making our way, all of that stuff. And Trudeau's connected to that thinking. I mean, he's in power for a long time, like not always king, but pretty close. I mean, he's there for a long time, defines Canada in a lot of ways, moving into the 1980s when things also start to change. But yeah, I think you make good points, and this is why I wanted to talk about that you've expanded the prime minister series to include opposition leaders, because we're losing in many ways half the story, right? Like you mentioned Stanfield, who no one, probably the people who will watch this or now or later, I have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah,
I mean, he comes up. If you study the Second World War politics very closely, he comes up multiple times, and the things he's doing and all of that, he's there. He's part of the story, but no one has any idea who you're talking about.
No,
it's just, I think it's a mistake and I blame ourselves for this one. I mean, not you and me. You know what I mean? Like, this is also, but this is a trend, and I'm sure you're aware of it, though, in Canadian military history right now. To bring it back back to my subject matter area here, is this idea that we didn't tell our story for the Second World War.
Yeah.
So other people told the story, and it got we got left out. And I feel like we're doing that again, or have done that again, with talking about all these stories, or not talking about these stories that we should be. And we should be doing things like I don't know, running a podcast or a YouTube channel.
Yeah, exactly. We
don't do
get
that.
lost in the shuffle of the United States in a lot of ways. We don't like to talk about a lot of things with ourselves, and especially like the Second World War. Canadians know Passchendaele and Vimy Ridge, and they know D-Day and Dieppe. But they'll know a lot more about the First World War than they will about the Second World War. It's like even and I know you read it, the book where it was looking at how we responded to the Second World War and how we responded to the First World War, and we had all these memorials to the First World War, and then after the Second World War, we're like, well, we'll just put those names on these memorials.
Yep.
But it was such a quick thing to be like, we got to honor the First World War, and by the Second World War, we're like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll just even though it was a bigger war, we're like, well, we'll just slap it on. But Vimy Ridge is this mythological thing in our history, and I don't think there's any battle in the Second World War. Maybe Dieppe comes close, where Canadians know a lot about it and see it as an important battle, even though obviously Dieppe wasn't as successful for a variety of reasons as Vimy Ridge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I spent a long time thinking about these questions. I'm literally doing a live stream this weekend about kind of a fascination with defeat. It starts with the Canadian, I'm sure you saw that, but the Canadian idea of that, but also it's not just Canadians, which I have been saying since the beginning. It's a broader thing, so I want to look at that anyway. But yeah, you're right. Like this Dieppe connection to a Canadian identity of the Second World War, which is, like you said, not even close to what happens in the first with the memorials. I mean, there's complicated topic, like everything is.
Oh, yeah.
As historians always say, right? But the idea, right, that the memorialization of the First World War is so, it's tactile, I guess is the best way to say it. Because today, I mean, you can walk any town has one memorial. And 1939, 1949 is sometimes literally on the back, on the side. Because, and Tim Cook points this out in the book that you're talking about, is the memorials were different, right? Like every town also had a memorial arena that comes in place after the Second World War, and that's a big difference. And I think that's an interesting point in and of itself. But those arenas are gone. They've been renamed, rebuilt, whatever. Libraries that have closed. It's all these things, right? There's bridges that have been crumbled because of our terrible weather, things like that. And I think it's an interesting dichotomy that we don't talk about too much outside of maybe academic circles, which I think is something we can do. And I mean, you've looked, and again, I think your series is great, and I think you should do it. But I'm not blaming you again, because it's this another way to put it, this Canadian fascination with the First World War, right?
Yeah.
Of course, people are going to want to hear about that as a podcast. Like that's going to be a thing, right? It's going to be what people want to hear.
And that's what I found when I did that poll to say, like, what do you want to listen to? World War I was way more than World War II. So I was like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, and there's lots of reasons behind that. I mean, maybe you share your thoughts as someone who doesn't do the military history like day in, day out, like me, and who's kind of, lost in the muck and all the fighting of it all, about like what you think about that or why that is the case, because you do work in this and you already did, and you already said you're doing more. So you're going to come up on this stuff again, just this place that these two world wars have in Canada, or don't, I guess is another way to say it.
Yeah, I think, well, the First World War, I mean, was big for Canada because it really kind of, in many ways, brought us together as a country, and then very nearly broke us apart with the the conscription crisis. So I think I don't know. It's not that we don't in school learn about the Second World War, but maybe, at least from my perspective in Alberta, we learned about the First World War. We learned some about the Second World War, but more in how it became the Cold War. And I think maybe that, and then when we watch movies and things like that, the Americans have really kind of co-opted the Second World War and made it, they won it. Canadians are kind of lost. We were in D-Day, but we are not really seen in movies about D-Day. You see Americans, maybe you see some British, but you see mostly Americans. And it's kind of funny, like Canadians, we have this mythology about the First World War, not about the Second World War, but Americans have flipped that. They were in, the First World War briefly. Most Americans barely know anything about it, but they know a lot about the Second World War. And I think that's maybe why we as Canadians know more about our First World War, because we didn't have that overarching American presence of dominating the story. We could be like, well, we have Passchendaele, and we have Vimy Ridge, and we have the Battle of the Somme, and we have, like you mentioned, Arthur Currie and we have all these Victoria Crosses and Billy Bishop and all this, and so we were able to kind of put a lot into that. I mean, just look at the Red Baron shooting down, being shot down. You know, Canadians were like, "Oh, it was a Canadian who did it," even though it was probably Australians on the ground who did it, but we don't know for sure. But
we'll never know.
Yeah, exactly. But we attach a lot to this, and then we had all these memorials built right after the war. I mean, we don't have anything like the Vimy Memorial for the Second World War. There's I haven't seen it. I'd like to, but the structure is massive. Like, it's just this gargantuan thing.
Oh yeah.
And we don't have anything like that for the Second World War for Dieppe or anything. Even though I have covered things from the Second World War in Canadian History Ehx, and there are very interesting people like Tommy Prince and very interesting battles, but then even beyond that, you know, the Boer War, barely any Canadians know about that, but that was our first real, okay, we're going to go overseas and fight. And then the Korean War, you know, we had a huge part in that. I did the Battle of Kapyong, and you know, we were vastly outnumbered, and the Princess Patricias fought and defended a hill, and we don't ever talk about that. It's all the First World War that kind of dominates everything, and it is important because it did define Canada in many ways. We did fight, you know, our own units, our own country, our own uniforms. You know, there was good and bad things. I did an episode on Sam Hughes, which was, that guy was, I'll give him props. He did keep the Canadian units together so that we could fight as that. But then there were so many other things where he was just, it was like he was off his rocker. I mean, his invention of, I think it was a shovel with a hole in it.
Yeah.
So you could shoot through it.
I want to do a video on that for sure.
Yeah.
I haven't had the time, but I definitely am going to do that.
We don't knight people in Canada because of Sam Hughes, because he kept pushing to be Sir Sam Hughes to the point where Parliament was like, okay, we're not doing this ever again. And we did do it briefly in the 1930s with R.B. Bennett, and then we stopped after that. But Sam Hughes was a really interesting one. Just the guy was a real, like Diefenbaker, had a very different view of himself than what other people saw. But much more than Diefenbaker. I think Diefenbaker was a better person than Sam Hughes was. Yeah, exactly. The Donald Trump of his time, without a doubt. He had this huge view. I mean, even King writes about him in his diary and going for lunch with him, and says, you know, he sat down for lunch and all Sam Hughes did was talk about the brief time from 1914 to well, before that, but when he was in the First World War, the defense minister.
Oh yeah. He takes over when Borden takes over.
Yeah, and so all he did was talk about that. He just talked about that the whole thing, and King says it was really kind of sad and depressing to this guy's reliving his glory days from the First World War, and no one liked him. Like, everybody could not stand this guy.
Everybody hated him.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I had known him, I would have been like, God, like I can't imagine. But I will, like I said, he did kind of take Canada from a militia to a fighting force very quickly. But
yeah, he did. Well, I don't know. I'm pausing because, and I've heard that too, right? He's the one who keeps. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I gotta collect my thoughts because Hughes gets me riled up. I mean, and I laugh because of these sham shoes, because he literally ordered shoes from a buddy of his, and they were terrible. They would dissolve in the mud because they were made of paper. Like, he was so bad in so many ways. And I get the arguments. I've read the books, looked at everything. Yes, Sam Hughes was the Minister of Militia and Defense at the time the First World War breaks out. Was it put together because of him? My gut says no. I'm still thinking anyone could have organized a Canadian fighting force. But yeah, the idea of Canadian units staying together. I mean, I laugh when you said that, not because it's not true, but because of his well-known behavior at Valcartier, where he's literally ripping units apart, figuring out, he makes up this numbered system that's never used before or again. Exactly. And everyone's just like, okay.
And he promotes people randomly, even though he doesn't really have the ability to do that. You're the defense minister. You're not like a colonel here. And he'd be in Valcartier, and he likes somebody, and he's like, well, you're a captain now. It's like,
he would meet people for 5 seconds and be like, you're a major now.
Like, I don't think that works that way.
But I mean, yeah. Anyway, he's a. I mean, you can talk about him for days and days and days.
Oh yeah, that was my
He's
favorite episode of my first season. Actually, was
oh
Sam
yeah,
Hughes because
he's I mean,
he's
just
somebody who came along at the right time for himself,
oh, 100
without a
percent.
doubt. Yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, and I think you've talked about. You were talking about one day, like he was because he was a teacher for a very, very brief time,
Yes, he was.
months, not even years, like months.
Yeah.
And something about wanting to eat chalk or eating chalk,
Yeah,
or
he
something.
used to eat chalk. Like it's the piece of chalk. He would just be talking at the board, and he would just start eating chalk. And like I don't know if he thought he had upset stomach or something, but it really bizarre. And with the Boer War, he kept like pushing
Oh,
to
geez.
lead to
Yeah,
be in it. And then I think he finally went over. Like he actually brought his own uniform. Like
he did.
it's really kind of sad in a way of I don't know. Like you bring your own uniform to fight, and then they finally. I think it was a few months ago that I wrote it, but essentially something happened where they wanted to get rid of him, and so they sent him back to Canada, but they gave him like a glowing reference because they didn't. I don't know. He's just
Well, he
yeah.
well, that's another story again that no one is talking about in terms of no one. When I say no one, I mean the broader scale of things like that. Like you want an interesting Canadian story, you can talk about Sam Hughes for a month because this guy.
Oh, yeah.
And I always say, just even outside his military stuff, that was nuts. Like the chalk thing, the fights he would get into, literally fist fights, and then get his butt kicked.
Yeah.
And then somehow turn it that he was the great victor. Like he talks about that one at length.
Creates this whole story around himself.
He's a newspaper man too, which is obviously very helpful. He's an Orangeman, which
yeah.
not a fan. As a French Canadian, not a fan of that thinking, anti-Catholic, anti-French.
Oh, and he was. I mean, he was super anti-French.
That's why he was defense minister, because Borden used him to bring that section of Ontario along. Because Hughes is from Ontario.
Yeah,
a bit north. We call it the north. It's not really north, but it's more cottage country now. But anyway, yeah, he's such an individual who, and then you throw the military stuff in there. South Africa, he stows away on a boat, literally.
Right. Yes.
Go. He doesn't listen, gets on a boat, and then he does one of those surprise, I'm here.
And then he creates this mythology around it too. He was the hero of a battle. And I think he talks about his commander was like starting to cry, and he's like, no, we can do this. And he mustered everybody together. And it's like, this is clearly not true. Like you definitely have a different view of what happened than what actually happened.
He's a bit Churchillian in that way, that he just kind of, Churchill didn't do those things he wrote about, but he embellished a lot.
Yeah.
Especially, but Hughes is embellishing all of it.
Yeah.
He
the
won
whole
the Victoria Cross for this victory.
Oh, he kept campaigning for it too. He kept writing letters for it.
He did till his death in the 1920s.
Yeah.
Stop. Anyway, well, Norma, who's also a great supporter of the show, brings up a very good point, and something we could talk about: his treatment of General Currie.
Oh yeah,
and also Garnet Hughes, Sam's son, who's the commander and friends with Currie for a good chunk of time, but also commander of the 5th Division, which gets broken up famously and is parceled throughout the Canadian Corps for reinforcements at the end of the war. And then his son joins in this hate fest that Currie faced from Sam Hughes. Even Sam Hughes was tormenting Currie after Sam Hughes was dead.
Oh yeah.
Another famous story, which again, it got some attention during the first, centenary of the First World War, because of the trial that took place and the claims of libel that Currie won, and all these things, that Currie was a butcher and he was sending men to die at Mons when the war was over, which is not true. And still, people believe that it's still around, even though literally there was a court case about this. And it goes on and on. You could talk about this story itself. Yeah. Well, there is a book, right? Tim Cook wrote on this.
And it's like Norma says, Donald Trump of that time. He has a very different view. He can't lose. He can't, as soon as Borden dismisses him, he immediately turns on Borden, even though Borden was very loyal to him and kept him in power as defense minister way longer than he should have, just because of loyalty from years ago when Hughes did stick with him. But he immediately turns on him. And as soon as he's let go, he starts attacking the prime minister. It becomes a joke by the end, like I said, with King. Yeah.
Yeah, he would attack anyone. That's why his son gets involved, because he attacks Currie, because he takes his son's command away at the divisional level when Sam believed that Garnet Hughes should lead the Canadian Corps, which is just bonkers. I mean, it's and then Norma makes another good point, and this is she's not the only one to say this, but about his premature death, which I would argue is the stress of the war, which he eventually did get over. And I would say he's, again, we can't diagnose people in the past, but he suffered from PTSD from his war service.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and Curry was on the front lines himself at Second Heap, which you have chronicled in your podcast as well. And I was listening to that this morning. Very well done. Anyway, yeah. So I did want to say that you do so much. You're covering details. We talked about this before we jumped on. But that you do Kitchener's Wood, which does not get talked about in the Canadian ever, because Second Heap takes all this attention. The gas attack, the stand, pushed quite back, far back. Don't get pushed quite back, but they do stand and hold, which is true. But anyway, so yeah, you talk about these things. I think it's great, so people should check that out because everything's down below. Yeah, so you do a great job with that. I'm going to start listening to more. You say more of that's coming. So I wonder if you could just kind of give us towards the end here, because I do have to jump off soon. But kind of what's coming up for you, what you have planned into the new year, what you're going to be doing, anything new, any new insights you'd like to be able to give us?
Well, Pucks and Cups started its second season last week, and so I'll be talking on that about early hockey history. Next week is the Dawson City Nuggets, who made that amazing journey from Dawson City all the way to Ottawa by dog sled and everything just to compete for the Stanley Cup. So I'm going to talk about that next week. And then Canadian History Ehx goes every single week. I'm talking about women's suffrage, and then I'm talking about Joseph Brandt. I've got episodes coming up on a variety of things. The Avro Arrow, the Edmund Fitzgerald, SCTV will be in January, because I do my nostalgia episodes every few months.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. And then once I'm done with I keep on saying Parks and Rec, Pucks and Cups. Once I'm done with Pucks and Cups, after 10 episodes, so that's the beginning of February, then I'll start season 2 of Canada's Great War, and I'll start looking. I think right now I'm about 1916, so I'm going to be looking into that 1916 going into 1917 for 10 weeks, and then back to Pucks and Cups, and then from John to Justin every single week. Right now I'm just starting to finish up the opposition leaders who never became prime minister, but I have all of the elections Canadian history, all of the prime minister Canadian history already done. And then we're going to start on the premiers. I'll do 5 at a time for each province. Probably start with Ontario, and then Quebec, and then New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, BC, and so on. And then once I get through 5, I'll go back to Ontario, do the next 5, just to keep variety. I'm not spending too much time on just one. Like Ontario will take me. They've got 45 premiers, so that's a year. That's a year just on Ontario. So yeah,
there's a lot.
Yeah, exactly. Got to mix it up a bit.
Yeah, so yeah, you've got lots coming up. I mean, yeah, Norma's right. Everyone should do this. Follow Craig's stuff. He's on social media. Like I said, you're good. You're on Twitter. You're doing like I do. Try to get people involved. Bring up random. You're more random than me, and I say that again in the best way, because you can be. And
every day on this day in history, if you want to learn something that happened on this day, I'll have posts about it every day. So
yeah, you post about some crazy thing that happens that even I forget about, or I'm learning from you. I learn from you all the time. Like even the local stuff, right? What you do, which is amazing, because it doesn't get done, right? You're doing these tiny little towns with all these crazy stories and all these things that happen, and no one would know about them outside localities without the internet.
So and they have cool histories.
Yeah. I mean, the things, even the photos, I mean, like the photos that you post and the things that these tiny little towns, it doesn't surprise me, right? I grew up in Ontario. I went to Northern Ontario a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
With all the statues. I mean, I've been to Wawa, Ontario, I don't know how many times.
The Canada Goose. Yeah.
The giant Canada Goose on a pedestal. I mean, like to us, I guess that's normal. But like, it's just, it's great to see like you doing this in areas like I haven't been to Alberta myself. I haven't been to small town Alberta, especially when I probably do get out there. It won't be till these small towns probably right away, because I got people always wanted me to come see stuff, and they're all in the big cities. So I got that to do. But yeah, so that's great. I think that's a thing that more attention should be drawn to, and you're doing it. And I want people who might not know about you, or non-Canadians especially, check out your stuff. You're all on there below. I'll add your YouTube channel after. I forgot about that. Sorry about that. I got everything else on you. I just forgot that. But yeah, I will definitely get that in there, because you got some interesting stuff on there too, because you can, like you've said multiple times. Oh, we have a question for you, so I'll get that in a second. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, you do different stuff, again, because of the different platform that is video and what you can do with it that you can't do. on the podcast. Sorry, and we'll just do one question here because especially from so
actually
I've heard of.
Yeah, I know a lot about Canadian history and the small stuff, but I've never heard of that. I've covered the Fraser Gold Rush and the Dawson City or the Yukon Gold Rush, and things attached to that, but I've never covered that. So I'll write it down, and that's something I'll start looking into.
Yeah, write that one down for sure because that sounds. I mean, I've heard of iron pyrite and all of that before. I mean, another part of Canadian mythology is this mining. We're this, bastion of gold, and it's not what it is now, but not back then because it was all underground. But anyway, so there's something for you to check out. Again, this is why I love doing this stuff. People can talk to each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk about things that we've never thought of. It's amazing. But there's Grey County, Ontario. There you go.
Oh, okay, perfect.
No wonder it was fake. Not much going on out here that way. You want corn and beans? We got you covered. So much of the gold. Yeah, sorry,
I'll check it
Ontario, which not too far from Grey County. So, down southwestern Ontario way where I was born and bred. So, anyway, that's great. I look forward to what you got coming up. Big fan of everything you do, and you give me support in so many ways, which I am so thankful for. Jumping on here, it's great to have you and a supporter of Canadian history, just generally, even if I wasn't doing this. It's great to see someone talking about an area. Like, again, I said, it needs to be talked about in a broader way and in a more engaging way. I think this can maybe be my closing point, your thoughts on it real quick. We got a minute left. But again, it's our own fault. We haven't done this, and we have to fix that.
Yeah.
And you're doing that. I mean, that's great. And I know you agree, but...
yeah. Celebrate our history, the good and the bad. I mean, everything. Look at it all. Yeah.
Well, to paraphrase, Oliver Cromwell, the warts and all.
Yeah,
we've got a lot of warts. We got a lot of good, but we got a lot of warts. And
there's definitely a lot of warts.
And you do both, and I do both, and that's the way it should be done. But again, so I'll finish up saying, if you're not, this is very random. Sorry, I have to. I believe you are.
I am a vegetarian for 2 years now.
Susan's a great supporter. I love Susan's questions. I love it. She's always got great questions for me. That's probably the most random one she's ever asked. But anyway, so follow Craig on Twitter. He talks about that in a good way again all the time. I learn things from you about even cooking, and I'm not a vegetarian, so I've learned some things about that. But anyway, I do have to run because I have another history stops for no one, as I like to say. I have another meeting I have to jump on, but I'm just going to do a quick end up, and then I'll say bye, and then we'll sign off.
Sounds good.
So thanks everyone for watching. I really appreciate it. I say this like I close every time. Please subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps the channel grow. I'm still trying to hit that 1,000 mark, which is an important one for me, so I can kind of monetize the work I'm doing on YouTube and kind of get a little bit of money from it. It won't be much, but it'll be something which will help me keep doing this because I can't do it without that. And also, speaking of monetary support, you can become a patron. And the links are below for all of this stuff, or buy me a coffee as well. Any amount you can give is very helpful, helps me keep doing this because it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. So I need to do that. I need to get some more support to do that. So please do. And also follow on social media if you aren't already. All the links for mine are below. And I'll finish off by saying everything for Craig is now below as well, including the YouTube channel that he started recently. So keep that. Go on there, support him. Those of you who don't know Craig, please do get on Twitter, get involved. He will engage with you because I engage with him all the time. Maybe I annoy him, but he's just gonna have to deal. So anyway, follow him up, and he's like what I do, and I think it's great. So he's all over the place, but again, I mean that in the best way possible. So thanks for coming on, Craig. I really appreciate it. Did you have a good time talking just random history?
I had a great time. I love talking history, especially Canadian history.
Maybe we'll maybe have you back on again in the near future. Maybe we'll do something a little more structured when you get some of your new seasons going up in the new year. Yeah. Maybe we'll bring you back on just real brief, talk about that, because I do want to talk more about the hockey. I don't really get to do that because of my line, and it crosses over in very surprising ways.
It does.
But anyway, so we'll touch base about that. And I have another live stream coming up this weekend for those of you who want to watch. It's about more or less the Canadian fascination with defeat, which we touched on a little bit today, but I'll expand on that on Canada and kind of dig into that a little bit. So thanks again, everyone, for watching, and I'll see everybody on Saturday. So have a good day, everybody.